Hi, Marty. We'll get started in another few minutes or so.
Ed?
Dave, you're on.
Okay, so you're signed in as Wright, Illinois, right?
Yes. Yeah, we have a few participants. I think it's working that both of us are logged on as Wright, Illinois.
Well, let me. Yeah, I don't know. Since is it just no? There's a few other folks. It was
I'll,
that was the default when I clicked Zoom.
tell you what, I'm gonna log off and then log on as a panelist. That might be easier just to make sure.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right. Welcome to the folks that have signed on already. This is the magic behind the curtain, right? So just sit tight and we'll get everything up and running in just a second. Sorry, we'll be talking about the chat box and the Q&A. So David just sent something in the chat. All right, Ed's coming back. All right, you're back, Ed. Hey, remind me real quick. Do you want me to do any kind of intro, or do you have this covered?
Oh, a minute or so is fine. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Todd can see and hear both of us. I think we had 57 people registered. It seems like not everybody tends to make it. Something comes up, or they register knowing that they're going to get the recording. So, all right, we'll start in a couple minutes here. In the meantime, those that have joined, do kind of poke around and you'll see that there's a chat window as well as a Q&A. So what we've been trying to do is use the Q&A for questions and then the chat for any kind of dialogue that might go back and forth. So I'm going to keep an eye on that since Ed's got the meat of the presentation. And just like last time, Ed, when questions pop up, I'll interject/interrupt.
Sounds good.
Right at noon now. And there's also the ability to raise your hand. I know last session, Ed, you had quite a bit of information you wanted to get through. So towards the end, if it's easier, if we have time, we can unmute folks to ask questions, especially if it's something specific. So kind of have three ways to communicate. Otherwise, we are in control. I like this. Well, we're at 12:01. Oh, Bill Chalberg is already. Yeah. See, if we let Bill talk, then we'll lose all of our time, right? I just switched over to my hotspot. I forgot to do that. All right, so we've got 19 folks signed on. You want to go ahead and get started, Ed?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, so I'll just say a few words here real quick. We've been doing this is Dave Simmons with Wright, Illinois, and we've been doing a series of webinars just to share information. You know, it's kind of it is a different time, and so we appreciate everyone who signed on today. The webinars that Ed's been doing are specifically infrastructure focused, so it's a lot of great information, and I know it pulls in a diverse audience. So Ride Illinois is your statewide nonprofit bike advocacy organization. So we're working to make biking better for you and continue to do so even in this somewhat unprecedented time. So since some folks just joined, I just wanted to reiterate that there are ways to communicate with both myself and Ed, either through the chat for kind of just general comments. Please use the Q&A if you have specific questions that you want to make sure that we get to Ed. And then there's the ability to raise your hand as well. So I'm going to keep an eye on that while Ed shares the bulk of the presentation. And with that, Ed, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. All right, thanks, Dave. I'll get this all set up. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Barsotti. I'm with Wright, Illinois. We are recording this webinar, so that will come out. That link will come out fairly soon. Dave's gone over how to ask questions throughout. So let's get started. A little bit about Wright, Illinois. I need to adjust my screen a little bit. Pardon me. Wright, Illinois is a statewide bike advocacy nonprofit. We work on a number of different things to try to improve conditions for cyclists. One of those include advocating for bike-friendly road projects and design policies. That's the subject of this particular webinar. Some of our specialization, some of our expertise on this, I've actually been a bike planning consultant for 20 different cities within Illinois, and we've helped out dozens of others over the years. Also, we have provided design input and suggestions for hundreds of road projects around Illinois. I just did one for Central Illinois about 2-3 hours ago. So one of our specialties is determining what type of bikeway is appropriate where. That includes when you're going to do a road project, how might bikes be accommodated? Some general thoughts on this webinar. First of all, a lot of people who don't bike much will think about trails naturally. Off-road trails on their own rights of way. When they think about biking, they think about trails, and it gets a lot of attention. But most biking still does occur on roadways, and that topic doesn't get as much attention. So that is, in fact, our members' #1 priority is for us to try to fill that gap, work with agencies, work with consultants, and so on to try to get our roads a little more bike-friendly. So what this webinar will go through is our process of how we advocate for this, as well as we'll go through maybe 15 or 16 different example requests covering a range of topics to show you what might be possible when you design your roadway project. We are meant to be a resource for towns and advocates and consultants as well. So already I think I talked with 3 different attendees from last week about some projects that they're working on, and I invite you to contact us after this one as well. So the way we're going to do this, accommodating bikes and road designs, there are a couple of different factors. One is policy. Is there a good policy in place? Is there a commitment by that agency to accommodate bikes and peds as well? And are there good details on the design standards? So how it is done is important as well. So we're going to cover policy at the local level, counties, and then state. Then after that, the rest of the webinar will be on specific projects. I'll talk a little bit about our process when we receive a request from a member or another cyclist, or our proactive work of looking at upcoming road projects. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll have maybe 16 or so different examples where I talk through what our thought process is. So policy for road design, bike accommodations and road designs, we'll start off at the local municipal level. And many towns have adopted a complete streets policy of accommodation. It's adopted by the city council or an ordinance, and it becomes their official commitment that when a project comes up, they'll look at bikes and peds. But in order to have your complete streets policy have a little more meat to it, you want to make sure that your road design standards are also adjusted to accommodate that commitment. So there are details involved. Last week's webinar covered a lot of the different bikeway types, what's appropriate where. It covered some of the different manuals that are out there nationally on how to adopt good road design standards. And then I threw out a point for those interested in pedestrian issues. The Federal Highway Administration actually has a table called New Sideway Installation Guidelines, in which it recommends sidewalks on either one or two sides of the street or just paved shoulders, depending on the context of a roadway. So I would recommend, if you're interested in that issue, if you're with the town, to just Google on the FHWA's New Sidewalk Installation Guidelines, and you'll find it. Also at the local level, in addition to making a commitment and adopting design or roadway design standards, a couple of different policies include a bicycle or bike ped plan that is meant to say we want to retrofit our community in this way. So a bike plan, which we'll discuss next week in a lot more detail, will indicate what roads are indicated are preferred for inclusion in a bike network in a town and how to go about doing that. Having an adopted bike plan also helps you to win the state and federal grants that are out there. And again, we'll talk about the grants next week as well. Another policy that a town can do, which is separate from complete streets, is to have a separate budgetary line item for retrofits and for matching some of the grants that you might be able to get. So an example is in Rockford. I'm currently finishing up a bike plan in Rockford where they have a complete streets policy in place. When a road project comes up, they automatically look at how they can improve things for bikes and peds. But at the same time, they recently bumped up a line item to $300,000 per year to go back to places in town that are not going to be where road projects occur in the next few years, but a retrofit needs to occur more quickly, earlier than that. So using this line item budget, they will go through and implement their bike plan, retrofitting those places that are not scheduled for improvement in the next few years. My estimate on what's an appropriate amount for that line item, $1 to $2 per year per resident, and Rockford used the $2 per year resident figure in getting their $300,000 total. At the county DOT level, so many of the metro areas around Illinois, county roads are important for being able to get around, especially in suburban type development. And we found that to be the case in several places around the state. So back maybe 9 years ago, we did a survey of the different policies that the county DOTs have. We then, last year, we redid that survey for the Chicagoland counties only. And what we found is that almost all of the counties are really in the last 15 years making progress on the issue of bike ped accommodation. They've adopted formal policies. They have one of their staff members look at each individual project with that perspective. How can we accommodate bikes and peds? And the counties that have adopted these policies, when there is an off-road accommodation, a sidewalk, or a trail alongside of the road, that county will either pay some, most, or all of the cost for those off-road facilities. Will County, unfortunately, is the lone holdout on this topic, but we're seeing good progress around the state. A few slides on the state level. IDOT has, for those who are advocates in particular and are not familiar, IDOT has two different manuals that are really key to the accommodation policies. The Bureau of Design and Environment governs IDOT roadways, IDOT jurisdiction roadways. So when there's a state road project, they look at that manual, chapter 17, where you'll see a lot of the policies. I'll summarize those a bit in the next slides. And then IDOT also has a Bureau of Local Roads and Streets manual, which is used whenever there's state or federal money spent on a local agency road project. So when that occurs, the towns will develop the plan, send it to IDOT. IDOT uses that manual to either approve the design or say something has to change. Unfortunately, both of the manuals have badly lagged behind the national best practices and state of the art. But the good news is that, especially in the past year or so, that they are catching up quite a bit. The BDE manual for state roads had their Chapter 17 entirely rewritten. Lots of great changes took effect last summer. And the BLRS manual, I'm actually on the committee that's rewriting the bike chapter for that. So hopefully that manual becomes more user-friendly or more bike-friendly within the next couple of months or so. If you as a town or you as an advocate, if you come across times where maybe IDOT will reject your suggestion or your design, it may be that what you're suggesting is already adopted by the Federal Highway Administration, but it just hasn't made its way into those IDOT manuals yet. In those cases, you can point to the federal manuals, the federal rules, and that should help you to be able to get your design approved. So at the state level, for IDOT roads, back in 2007, there was a state complete streets law. That made its way into IDOT policy, IDOT design policy in 2010. That law, that policy is really only in effect for the major projects that IDOT does. A reconstruction of a roadway, an expansion, replacing a bridge, redoing an intersection. It's more than just your simple resurfacing projects. The law focused on urban areas, but IDOT has actually expanded those policies to extend to other places around the state that meet certain warrants that they have. So maybe the main street in a rural town, the warrants will be met, and the complete streets policy that IDOT has will come into play. Last year, as part of the rewrite of Chapter 17, IDOT adopted a new bikeway table, a selection table, according to what is the speed, the traffic level, and so on. It used to be that table was primarily side paths, which is trails off the road, with bike lanes in a lot fewer situations. The new table has a lot more emphasis of on-road, but it does state that off-road side paths are an allowable option for most of these cases. Something to be aware of in the IDOT policy is that if the primary recommendation can't be met, then the next highest and best, quotes, is what can be implemented. Unfortunately, the policy does not include a lot of guidance on what is the next highest and best. And what we've seen sometimes, for example, when a side path was not able to be built, it was considered the next highest and best simply to grade the grass next to the road to be level so that a future trail could be added. There's a lot more that could be done in between those two extremes. And I think we'd be glad to work with anyone on that next highest and best issue. And then finally, on the complete streets policy, there is an 80% state, 20% local cost share that applies for both off-road and on-road, but it's 100% state for accommodations along a bridge. Okay. All right, so turning attention now to IDOT's simpler road projects, the resurfacing projects. These are exempted from the state law if there is no widening of the asphalt. However, as we'll see in a couple of the examples later, the existing width of a roadway could be reallocated with bike lanes provided, road diets, which we'll cover in the examples, and other features that could be done. In addition, if a town does want to add additional features to a resurfacing project, it's on them. They have to pay for the additional engineering. They have to pay for the incremental cost and so on. So even though there are a lot of resurfacing projects out there and the law doesn't specifically apply to it, there are opportunities on resurfacing projects. Okay, so that's a quick look at the policy level. But even if you have a good policy at your town or your county at the state, it's still important to get into the specifics for a particular location, for a particular roadway design that's coming up. And that's something that we've gotten involved with quite a bit. First one, we'll look at our retrofits. Retrofits being a separate project where we might hear from a local cyclist that there's a safety issue on this particular roadway. So they'll let us know about it and they'll ask, is there something that we can do about it? If that's the case, then we will investigate it. We'll see Is something feasible for that location? Is it somewhere that's a justified request? We only want to make requests that we feel are reasonable. If we do find that it's something that we do want to request, then we'll write up the detailed recommendations to the road agency, and usually there's follow-up on that. So I'd like to show you a little bit about how we make the determination on whether something rises to a priority level. Some of the tools that we use for that, and these same tools you as designers, you as advocates could use to determine the need for accommodations, are the ones that we've listed. First one, which I'll include in the next couple of slides, Strava is a phone app that you can find online, a heat map that shows where cyclists ride. There are additionally traffic counts for the roadway itself, motorized vehicular traffic counts. We take a look a lot at Google Map imagery. What's the land use? We look at local bike plans. Is this a road that's listed in a bike plan, but perhaps that did not come to the attention of the roadway designer? Crashes, and then local cyclist input as well. So all of these factors we take into account when deciding, is this a roadway that makes sense to make a request about? So I mentioned Strava. It is again, it's a phone app that a subset of cyclists will use to track the different trips that they take by bike. And the website that you see there, if you were to type it in, you could look anywhere in the world for where people in that area, where local cyclists will ride. So I use it when I travel, and I find out what are the good routes to check out the town. But as a planning tool, it can be very helpful to know where there is more demand. The online version is very rough, but you can kind of tell relative demand levels. If you want the more detailed data, which goes down to the time of day, what direction cyclists are going, exact counts, that can be purchased from Strava. I hear it's very expensive. I know Cook County has purchased it. Some of the pros and cons regarding Strava. Again, the free version is a relative level, so you're able to get a rough idea of what roads are more important than others for bikes. And I have found that it's very helpful because bicycle counts are pretty rare to come by, especially for roadways. So when you don't have anything else to go on, Strava is a good first step. Some of the negatives, it's primarily for your more club level riders. People who are more casual cyclists, or they're using their bike out of necessity to get to their jobs, they're usually not tracking their trips on Strava. So you get only a subset of the community, but it is still very helpful. And half of the trips that Strava records are, in fact, commute trips they have found. So it's a useful tool. Yes.
If I could interject real quick. I know several years back, requested access to some of the more detailed data. And because, as you mentioned, Cook County had already purchased that data, they have a contract with them, there wasn't going to be any additional costs. I mean, I was just reaching out as an advocate. Now, I did go so far as to get access to the data, but at the time didn't really have anything to do with it. So I believe if an umbrella, jurisdiction, if you fall within there and they have a contract, that you could get access to it without additional cost.
So that's my impression too. I have not spoken to Cook County about that exact issue, but my understanding is that if a certain geographic region has purchased the data and is using it, that any of the towns within that county, for example, could use that data.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, good question. Okay, so that was a little look at some of our process when we receive requests from local cyclists to do something about a bad location. The next section will take a look at our process of being more opportunistic, of looking ahead at upcoming road projects. And the reason why we do that instead of simply looking at retrofits is that it's usually cheaper, often much cheaper, to make a request and to make a design change to accommodate bikes as part of a project that's already going to be done anyway. So in that case, the ideal would be to have a complete streets policy and good standards in place. But again, you have a lot of location-specific context that it makes sense to look and provide specific input early in the process. So that's really what we're trying to do. For advocates that are listening on, the source where we can find that information, IDOT has an online map of their multi-year program. You can find out what they're planning and roughly when, give or take a couple of years or so. Many counties will publish their upcoming road projects online. Several towns will also publish their capital improvement programs, where you'll find what they're planning on doing, what roads will be resurfaced and reconstructed over the next year or more. And then within metropolitan areas, there are documents called TIPs, where you can find some of that information for projects that are getting federal money. I mentioned that when we do make our request, we try to be very reasonable about it. For example, out in the suburbs, if there's a 45-mile-an-hour road and people are turning quickly at intersections, our request is not going to be to tighten the turning radius to something like you might see in downtown Chicago. We do try to make ourselves aware of what are the various concerns, what are the other issues in engineering and road design, and we look for ways of providing a win-win, looking for a way where accommodation can't be done without sacrificing the other factors that engineers are trying to do. Our suggestions will often quote state and national standards. The latter, especially if it's a situation where IDOT's manuals have not caught up with the national standards yet. Sometimes in our suggestions, we'll give examples of peers that have done exactly the same things. And we usually have some amount of follow-up to see what happened when that project was done. Sometimes if a picture might be worth 1,000 words, and so we'll include an overhead of that location and describe what it is that we think would help. So that's the second part of the presentation, where we've looked at policy. It's important to advocate good policies and to adopt good policies, but it's also important to look at the project level at what are the very specific details of that location, since a policy cannot possibly cover every scenario. Dave, are there any questions yet before we jump into the examples?
Just a comment here. Terry mentioned that the Strava heat map will also show that places that folks will avoid, that cyclists will avoid, so that can be, I guess, factored into decisions.
And I'll follow up on that too. It's important to know that Strava is showing existing conditions. It does not necessarily correlate to latent demand. So it may well be that that road isn't getting as much use as it otherwise would because it's just terrible. It's just really hard to bike on. But lacking a good measure of the latent demand, Strava might be a good starting point. You just have to keep that in mind.
I think that's it for now.
Okay. All right. So we'll move on to the different requests that we make. And over the last couple of years or so, when we've worked on opportunistic road projects, we focused primarily on IDOT roadways, one by one for the 9 districts around the state. We took a look at their list of what they have coming up over 5 years. We filtered it down, typically for each district, excluding Chicagoland District 1. But for the other ones, typically we might have 10 to 18 projects that we have some input on. And a lot of those end up being resurfacing projects, bridge replacements. That's really what's going on. Now that we have a capital bill and there's additional money, I think we're going to see perhaps some more comprehensive projects and some additional type of projects going on. For IDOT District 1, we focused on resurfacing projects. There were 215 within District 1 alone, and we sent in suggestions for about 140 of them with follow-up meetings as well. So that's the context that I'd like to convey to you before we look at roughly 15, 16 different examples. The examples that I'll show will start off with on-road accommodation suggestions, and then we'll move on to some of the off-road things that that we requested. So this one actually wasn't a request. This is something IDOT did, IDOT District 9 did on its own with the city of Carbondale. Here's a roadway where you had a one-way US 51 through downtown Carbondale. It was 2 lanes, and there was quite a bit of extra width in those lanes, enough so that the lanes could be narrowed, still well above what the minimums are, but the lanes could be narrowed, and it left enough room for bike lanes on a bike lane on the right side of the road. So that's an easy one. When we then did a bike plan in Carbondale, we made the same request for some of the other IDOT roads in that town. Sometimes when you have bike lanes, you get to intersections and you don't have enough width to carry that bike lane through the intersection because you have turn lanes. When you do have right turn lanes, something you could do is to add shared lane markings on the left part of the exclusive right turn lane. This is something that's fairly recent. I didn't cover it last week on the bikeway types because it was a relatively minor issue, but the FHWA did approve it, and it's on their MUTCD website of recently accepted updates. So that is one way of handling an intersection for bike lanes that we had requested in a couple of projects. The NACTO guide, the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide, is a source for some other possible treatments that either we could ask or that others could implement. An IDOT project that we looked at and made a request on was in Blue Island. We saw a 4-lane road that was really kind of overbuilt in a very residential area. 5,180 T is quite low for 4 lanes, it's very low. So we looked at the town's bike plan and saw that they had a recommendation for 4 lanes to 3 lanes on this resurfacing project. And that is what we echoed in our request, because we don't know if that bike plan made its way into the design process. We wanted to call attention to it. A couple more slides on road diet. This is what I mean by it. It was discussed last week a little bit. Here's an Urbana where a 4-lane road was converted to 3 lanes. That 3 lanes had enough width left over for a center turn lane with median, and there was enough room for bike lanes on both sides. So that's a case where the road was not widened. It was simply, when they resurfaced it and they had to put the stripes on anyway, it was reconfigured to allow for bike lanes and this road diet. Another road diet suggestion that we made involved taking a look at what Strava said. Here's a place in Western Springs that we noticed from Strava that it was kind of like the Panama Canal for bicyclists. Getting over the Tri-State Tollway in that area is pretty tough. There's not many options, but 47th Street is used quite heavily. So we noticed in this project that on this end, the road was 2 lanes. And on this, from this point on, it was 4 lanes, including the bridge. We also noticed that at a certain point, most bicyclists turned north and took more local roads than this IDOT road. So our request was, let's take a look at maybe doing a road diet for this section here. The traffic counts seem to allow for that possibility. It would be subject to an intersection and traffic study to see if you could feasibly go down to 3 lanes. But that was our recommendation for this segment because of how much bike traffic that we saw. Here's one a little more rural in Kane County and Wilmington. What we noticed with Strava was that there were a couple of very quiet country roads that people ride on. Not a ton, but a moderate amount. And unfortunately, those roads did not connect. You had a 400-foot section of Illinois 102 that people had to ride on, and that's considerably busier. So we looked at the Google imagery and we saw that there were, in general, stone shoulders there. And we asked that those stone shoulders be paved only for the 400-foot segment connecting those 2 roads. Kind of along those same lines, we noticed in Romeoville and Bolingbrook that Joliet Road was heavily used by cyclists. Bluff Road is up here. It's a very popular bike route, but people were using Joliet Road for a short part of this. We took a look and we saw that the current roadway has maybe 2 or 3 feet, 3 feet of shoulder, and then additional stone shoulder besides that. So our recommendation was to try to widen that shoulder in some way. 2 possible ways to do that. One is maybe narrow the inner lanes to 11 feet. You don't have as much truck traffic on the in the inner lanes, so going down to something less than 12 feet is very possible on inner lanes. That would give you a little more room for the shoulder, and you could also add some additional pavement. So those were a couple of different suggestions for this location to try to eke out a little more shoulder space. Similar to that, we noticed in North Chicago that here was a road that was 6 lanes, very busy. There was no off-road accommodations, and I forget the traffic count on it, 12-foot lanes, three on each side. But we still noticed that this was fairly popular with cyclists. So our conclusion was that this was most likely club-level cyclists who are more traffic tolerant and may not need as high of a level of accommodation as if we were trying to accommodate casual cyclists as well. So our thought was, if you don't want to widen the road, if you're going to resurface it, maybe have the 2 inner lanes on each side be 11 feet, and that would allow 14 feet for the rightmost lane. That 14 feet is actually the width by which a vehicle can pass a bike and maintain at least 3 foot of clearance, which is the state law. So just by simply moving over the lane widths at no additional cost really to the project, there could be some level of accommodation for the more advanced cyclists that are already using this roadway.
Yeah, and we do have a question here from Matt Weiss. So Matt was asked if there's a good resource for finding rural bike routes. I was typing back to him that the IDOT bike maps do rate roads based on safety and comfort. Matt, I'm guessing maybe you're looking for something online. So he's looking for something that documents roads with wide shoulders or wide lanes. So any other recommendations?
Yeah, so I think the IDOT maps, what they actually show for roadways is they show bicycle level service that I introduced last week. Mm-hmm. And bicycle level service is the comfort level given a roadway's geometry and traffic conditions. That geometry should include paved shoulders if those exist. The IDOT database that is used to then pull out the parameters and calculate BLOS on all those roads factors in paved shoulders as well. So yes, I agree with your suggestion that looking at the IDOT maps is definitely a good way to go. Their application of bicycle level service, I would suggest maybe some tweaks to, but it's a good first place to look. Another might simply be to look at Strava and see where local cyclists are going right now.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
And then a comment here real quick from Michael. So there's a proposed pedestrian bike bridge being added at 47th Street over 294 as part of that corridor reconstruction project. So
I did not know that. That's good to hear. That's certainly much more than a resurfacing. Okay, so another example that we've used, we've requested on IDOT roads, but a whole lot of local roads as well. Many times there are roads that you just don't have the ability to widen it, but it's a very popular bike route. Your options are very limited given the budget, given other considerations. So on those roads, at least something that can be done is to raise the motorist awareness level that this is a popular bike route. So this particular sign is one that we have worked with IDOT to get approved and use, and probably maybe 15 or so local agencies at this point. So this is something, again, it's not going to improve the comfort level that much, but it will raise awareness, and it is something that IDOT will allow. A couple more examples on roadways. This is one in Willow Springs, Illinois 171. Kind of hard to see, but let's see if I have my cursor here. Along the edges here, you'll see that there are rumble strips. Rumble strips are meant to prevent run-off the road crashes. The rumble strips are fairly wide, and there's not much room between the rumble and the edge of the pavement. Turns out that at this location, there is a trail, the Centennial or the Einen Canal Trail, probably, I don't know, 100, 200 yards that's to the right of where we're looking here. But unfortunately, that trail does not provide access to a couple of key roads that, that intersect with this Illinois 171. So we saw that in Strava, that people are in fact biking on Archer, even though there's a trail not too far away, and it's because they had to get to those roads. That brought our attention to the rumble strips being bad, that there's no way to cross over them, there's no gaps in the rumble strips, and there's not enough room to the right of them. So cyclists who do use this road will be biking in the lane, which will be confusing to a lot of drivers, thinking they should just move over into the shoulder. So on this particular road, our request was that when you do repave the road, including the shoulder, that you use IDOT's new, or fairly new, rumble strip design that is more bike friendly. It's not bike friendly in that you can ride over them, you cannot, but the rumble strips are narrower and it provides more room to the right of the rumbles. Now, a problem that we have with this IDOT design is that it does not specify that you need to have at least 3 or even 4 feet to the right of the rumbles. So that's something that we're kind of struggling with them. But if you are in a position of designing a roadway, you can look at this particular design standard to narrow the width of the rumbles and maximize the amount of clear zone to the right where cyclists can ride. Something that comes up in town after town where I've done bike plans is, I'm riding my bike and I'm on a quiet road. I get to a stoplight at a major road and I'm not able to trigger a green light. And the cars that come after me, I'm the first in line. The cars that come in back of me think they're being polite by being way far back. Well, then no one triggers the green and we're just sitting there. There's actually a state law about that. If a bike is unable to trigger a green after 2 minutes, they can treat it like a stop sign, which isn't very cool. I think an engineering solution is better. But this is an issue that comes up a lot. Some agencies rely on pedestrian push buttons, which are off the road. But what that requires you to do as a cyclist is get over to the side, lift your bike over the curb, walk your bike through the grass, push the button, come back, hopefully get onto the road and well positioned before it turns green. So it could be kind of a dangerous situation. There are solutions to this, which we've included in many of the requests that we've made. And that is, if it's a new stoplight, if it's a new reconstructed intersection, there are better loop types which are more sensitive to bikes and to motorcycles that can be used. Or it might simply be a matter of tuning the amplifiers in your detectors and marking for bikes and motorcycles where to position your bike to be able to have the best chance of triggering that green. We just did exactly that with Effingham. They were getting back from BLRS that they had to install these detector loops on roads that they wanted to install bike lanes. But we said, why don't you take a look at adjusting it, testing with a bike that's on the sweet spot of the detector and seeing if you're able to trigger a green. And they were able to do that without the extra expense of installing the dedicated detectors just for bikes. So there's ways to handle this issue. It's a lot bigger issue than what people give thought to on this, and we'd be glad to help. All right, so now we're moving to the off-road section, some different options there. And this is much more than just a resurfacing project. If you're going to be adding sidewalks or a side path trail, it adds a lot to the project. But still, we have made those requests, and usually it involves, if it's an IDOT road, usually it involves that the local agency has to be the one initiating the off-road facility request. So on many roads, what you'll see are what are called goat paths or desire lines. You'll see these worn paths of dirt where people do walk or bike. That's a good indication that there's quite a bit of demand here for pedestrians and bikes to have some sort of facility there. And when we see that in our investigation, it raises our priority in making the request for a side path or even a sidewalk. Here's one that we saw that was a context issue. So here's the Calcite Trail, which was installed several years ago, and it's in Palos Park at an intersection. We saw a ton of usage of that trail, but right over here happens to be the subway. And I experienced this with my wife personally, that getting to there became a lot more difficult of a situation. There was no curb cuts, there was no crosswalks, there was no ramps on this island, and so on. So when this project came up for resurfacing, we included in our request to add those features to allow for better access for people getting to the destinations in this strip mall. Here's one that we see occasionally. I do not understand this trend of not connecting sidewalks to the other side of the road, just having it being parcel-based. This is a trend that is growing, and it's just bad, really bad. So when we see that, we certainly request that the connections be made so that people that are biking off-road along this busy road can get to the other side. Another thing we see that we point out in our letters is the standard seems to be when you have a right-of-way for a roadway, that you put the sidewalk at the back of the right-of-way, at the very edges of the outsides of the right-of-way. And while that's great, if you're mid-block, when you get to intersections, it becomes a big problem. Look at this one, for example. If someone's walking or biking here, what do you think the chances are that the car is going to stop at this stop line? They're not going to be able to see anything. It's slim to none, probably less than 2%. So in our request in this situation, we request that the sidewalk crossing be brought closer to the parallel road so that off-road users are better seen in the intersection dynamics. Couple of places, couple of slides regarding trails crossing major intersections. Here's one where, if you look carefully, there are a couple of small right corner islands separating the right turners from the through traffic, but those islands are small enough that they're not used as part of the crosswalk for the trail. Our recommendation was, if you're going to reconstruct the intersection, let's expand it a little bit more so that you can build a larger corner island and use that to break up the crossing for trail users. Here's a good example of that being, or as it was designed. I showed this one last week. This is in the west side of Aurora at the intersection of Orchard and Galena, where the side path trail uses the corner island. The corner islands are recessed so that left turning trucks do not hit it. It does require some more room, but it does improve the safety, it improves the stop line compliance, and it's something that we as an organization recommend as a way to make things safer for bikes and peds without compromising the intersection LOS goals of road designers. Very similar to that, a trail crossing in Tinley Park, where it looked like creating an island may or may not be possible, creating the right corner islands. In that situation, then our recommendation was to use something called the lead pedestrian interval. You push the button, it's a ped button, and you as a trail user get a green light a couple seconds before right turning and straight ahead traffic does. So it's a way of avoiding conflicts when the light turns green. And then the last example that I have, here's one where, again, we looked at the context in Brookfield. We saw the Salt Creek Trail crossing a minor, a collector level road. And we saw that in this location that the right turn lane into a small parking lot wasn't that heavily used. So our recommendation was, is there a way to improve the crossing more than just a crosswalk and a sign? The answer is yes. IDOT does have a new policy now on what are the treatments for different situations. We also suggested, is there a way to add a median and restripe this so that trail users can cross half of the roadway at a time? All right, so That was a lot of information, a lot of different examples. But the point is that when you have an upcoming road project, it is an opportunity, whether it's a simple resurfacing project or something larger. It's an opportunity to improve conditions for cyclists and pedestrians. And as an organization, we're here to help, whether you're an advocate or a town or a consultant working for a town. Thank you very much. Are there questions?
Yeah, we've got some comments, Ed. So Adam actually shared an example, which I know you and I have spoken about, at Ridge and Devon in Elk Grove. And Adam, I live in Elk Grove, so as I mentioned, I know that intersection well, where it's got the special set of loop detectors plus the pavement marking, as well as the sign to instruct cyclists where. So yeah, that works out. That works out great. Let's see, Todd mentioned, says Todd Bright, we're working with the city of Elmhurst to put a new multi-use overpass over Illinois 83, just north of North Avenue. It's going to connect to Salt Creek Greenway Trail. Phase 1 report is under review. STP funding application has been submitted to DMMC. So there's some projects underway, which is great to hear.
Good.
Terry Witt mentioned that the 3-foot signs that are out, I believe those are in Bartlett. And I actually saw the signs that indicated cyclists no more than, I think it says three abreast is against the law or something to that effect. So pairing up those two really leaves an impact and helps to educate both motorists and cyclists.
It's a good approach. It's a good balanced approach.
Yeah. Other questions or comments, or if you want to raise your hand, unmute you, and you can share information that way too. All right, nothing coming in. Give folks a minute here. And just wanted to note that we will be putting the links to last week's recording of the webinar, as well as this week's, and actually all the webinars that we've done on our website. Hoping to get that up before the end of the week. So you'll be able to revisit or view any of the webinars that you've not been able to attend.
Next week's webinar, we're going to focus on the process of doing a local bike plan. What are the products you get out of it? What's some process tips and implementation tips as well. And then I'll go through a review of the different grant types that are out there with some practical strategies regarding those. Some of them have more demand than others, and I like to convey what we have watched over the years on that topic.
And just another question came in from Bill. The ADT traffic counts, that's average daily?
Average daily traffic, yes.
Traffic, yeah, okay. All right, well, I think we're all caught up on questions and that. So thank everybody for attending. You should get an email tomorrow with a link to the registration as well, if you registered in advance. So you'll be able to look back on the information that Ed shared. And Ed, as always, I learned quite a bit listening to these as well. So thanks for sharing all this great information.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks everybody for attending. Again, we're glad to help out. If there's any way we can help out, just let us know.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.